be here with you tonight as we talk about Generation Arise. I've heard some amazing words already. It's just been so wonderful. I want to ask a question, though, a different kind of question that has been asked throughout. And my question is this: what happens if they don't arise? What happens when a generation does not arise, does not serve Jesus, does not honor him? Throughout Israel's history, they had a reputation of falling in love with Jesus because Jesus saved them, or God rather. God saved them. They turned their faces back to God, and then there will always be a generation that didn't know him. And when that generation that didn't know God would surface, then God would give them over to themselves, give them over to their sins. You know, it's so difficult to be alive and loving Jesus now and seeing so much chaos in the world. Because in the midst of this chaos, you know what the answer is. The answer is Jesus. But so few people want to hear the answer. So few people want Jesus. And we just see carnage after carnage after carnage. So my question throughout tonight is going to be, what happens if they don't arise? So I want to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 9. All right, so I'm going to give a little bit of history, and then we're going to read a lot, if that's okay. So Moses led the Israelites he was leading them into the promised land, leading them from Egypt, and they were so excited. They're going into this land that God had promised them. He was going to give them the land overflowing with milk and honey, right? And Moses was their leader, but Aaron was the high priest. He was instituted. They gave him a fancy robe. They decorated the robe, and they gave him a position of authority before the Lord that only the high priest could enter into the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest could see the Lord. Only the high priest could pray for the sins of the people. Only the high priest could be the one that leads them and usher them into the presence of the Lord. That was Aaron's role. And God made a promise to Aaron. He told Aaron, your descendants, your seed, the male that comes after you, they will forever have this position before me. What an honor. What an honor. And then generations pass, and now in 1 Samuel we see Eli. How did Eli become first high priest? He was a descendant of Aaron that was passed down through the generations. And now Eli, the man of God, the leader of the nation, not only was Eli high priest, Eli was a prophet. He was the prophet and the high priest. He wore 2 crowns upon his head. The man had such amazing power and authority from God. And Eli, during this time, would lead the people before God. He would go into the holies of holies. He would pray for them. He was a man of his generation. And he would lead them before the Lord. But one generation removed was Eli's sons. A different generation. So let me read. Verse 9 says, talk a little bit about Eli. All right, so he was at Shiloh, and a woman comes with Hannah. We all know Hannah's story, Samuel's mother. So she wanted to have a kid. She was barren. The Lord did not bless her to have a child at this time. And the other wife made fun of her and she would just get so rejected, and then she couldn't take it anymore. She went and she poured her heart out before the Lord. She's sitting there, she's pouring her heart out. And verse 9 says, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on his chair in the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servants, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all of the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. And she kept praying to the Lord. Eli heard her mouth. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart. Her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my Lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the Lord of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. So here is this woman in anguish. She is hurting so deeply in her heart. And she only knows one thing: if I can just get to where God is. But see, at that time, there was no way for them to get there themselves. We're in a different generation altogether, aren't we? We don't need Eli to come and usher us into the presence of the Lord. We can go there ourselves through what Jesus did on the cross for us. We don't need to be so distant from God. He's not so far away from us. He is closer than he's ever been. But yet there are so many people in this world who will not serve him, who do not serve him, who are in anguish like Hannah. Eli, the man of God in that hour, just looked at her and he said, okay, go in peace. Whatever you're praying for, let it be done. He had the authority in the name of God to say those words. And we know that Hannah went home. She had a baby. She named him Samuel. And she raised that baby up, and then she took him to the temple. And she left him there so that he could serve God all of his life. A couple of observations that I took from there. One is, we have to be willing to go to those places, to where the hurt is, where the anguish is, and tell those people that there's a peace on this earth that they can have. Generations will not arise unless we as God people be more committed than ever to go and to tell them. And then you don't have to go far. People, if you look around your city, aren't people hurting in your city? All over your city. But we have to ask God, open up our eyes, open up our minds, Lord, so that we can go and we can just be an instrument for you. It's scary being an instrument. I mean, it's downright scary. And living in New York City, you see some people come across you and you're like, nope, somebody else turn. No. So I understand. It is scary. But if we're going to say generations arise, we're going to have to dig deep. And we're going to have to ask God to give us some courage. That's first of all. And secondly, we're going to have to take our blinders off and see the situation for its totality. Because if people are going to serve God, and that's what we want, we got to see the people who are not. And that's what we need to go after. So I remember once, I'm going to come back to Hannah before I go to Eli's sons. I was 16. At 16, I was not serving the Lord. I grew up in church. The truth is, we were dragged to church. And I heard what they said, but it didn't apply to me. And the more they took me to church, the more I did not want God. I just didn't want him. And so at 16, my school took a group of us on a school project. And they took us to a different part. At that time, I lived in Mississippi, a different part of Mississippi. And in this part of Mississippi, we were exposed to different people. And so they had to find us summer jobs, right? That was cool. We're going to get some money. Yeah. But the summer jobs fell through. And then the only work that they could find for us was working at a mental institution. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yeah, that was scary. So we were a bunch of girls. We walked up in and we walked into the cafeteria and the men started clapping and cheering and jumping. I was like, oh God, what are they thinking? And the lady with us, she made them sit down and honor their place. And we were girls. And to be honest, I didn't fully understand what a mental institution was at that time. So, okay, you're going to work here for the summer. That's what they said. So they gave every single person nice cushion jobs behind the doors, away from the people, except for me. And there was one other girl, she worked in the library, but there was a lady with her. So they put me outside in the ceramic area. And you know, when you make ceramics, they pour that stuff in a pot and put it in that heat, and then you take these sharp instruments and you chisel and form. So they would come, and that was their form of therapy. So they would tell me, whatever you do, don't make them upset. And I was like, am I crazy? You put these people around sharp instruments and you tell me don't make them upset? Like, that didn't make any sense to me. And so there was one man there. His name was Moses. So Moses, 25 years earlier, had killed his wife, cold blood, and he showed no remorse. And so they deemed that he was supposed to go to the mental hospital, which he did not need to go, in my opinion, but what do I know? And Moses was going to stay there forever because the one thing that they could not get Moses to do was to say, I'm sorry. Moses said, I will never apologize for that. So Moses had this reputation where, well, he wasn't the nicest of person. And he would come and I would try to be so cool because I didn't want to get stabbed. And I would just try to hold my peace. And Moses would just rub me the wrong way. And before you know it, we would be going at it like cats and dogs. And I would just be standing up to this man and be like, you don't talk to me that way. Do you understand who I am? You're a little girl. Sit there, know your place. I mean, we would go at it. They would come and break us up and be like, I told you, don't make him mad. And I was like, he made me mad. And so that was it. And we would just go at it. And then one day, I sat down. Moses was in front of me, and it had been so horrendous that I just sat down. I was gripping the table, and I was not having good thoughts. And then this feeling came over me. It was like flashes and emotions, and I was going back through Moses' past, and I could see his life, and he had all this hurt inside of him. And I was like, whoa, wow, no wonder he is just, So I went, when I got my free time, I sat down at the typewriter, and I had to do something with all of this pain, right? All of this stuff that was inside of me. I just didn't want it anymore, right? And I didn't know what to do with it. So I prayed to the Lord. I said, Lord, I'm going to write a poem for Moses. Help me to write this poem, but don't do anything else. Don't touch me. Don't do anything. Just help me to write this poem. And I just started typing. And the words started spilling out. And this poem was about God. And now all of a sudden, all of this stuff I learned and when I was a kid started coming back to my memory. And I was like, whoa, that was in there? Okay, this is good stuff right here. I'm typing. I'm talking about pain. I'm talking about a God that I don't even know. It doesn't make sense to me, but it sounds good on paper. And I can't remember the poem. I can't remember what that poem was, but the gist of it was, the name was The Long Road Ahead. And I just remember at the end, it said something like, it doesn't matter the path that you trod. At the end of it all, there's God. So I finished typing my poem, folded up, put it in my pocket. Moses come. The next day, I slap it on the table. Whop! Push it in front of him. He pushed it back. Oh, man, it's going to get nasty up in here. And I said, man, I am trying to give you something. Pushed it. He pushed it back. And then it dawned on me, he can't read. So I said, fine. But you're going to sit here and you're going to listen. Do you understand? I opened up the poem. I read the poem. It felt so good. Not because I was serving God or doing anything for God, because that burden was lifted. It was so annoying. And I got to the end and I said, it doesn't matter where your feet may trod. At the end of it all, there's God. I was folding the paper up and this man started crying. I mean, crying. I was very uncomfortable. And I'm just sitting there, and then I just start moving all the sharp instruments away. And then the lady that was over the activity center, who was one of the main people that was trying to warn me about Moses, and she was the one that told me, this is how I found out his story. She came and she saw Moses crying. She walked away, and I was like, really? You're going to walk away? Aren't you more qualified than me? She starts crying. And I'm like, something's wrong with this mental hospital. It's not right, not right. Then Moses looked at me and he asked me this question. He said, how do I find him? I kid you not. I had no idea who he was talking about. I said, find who? I'm thinking he's seeing somebody, right? Like that poem meant nothing to me. I'm thinking like he's hallucinating and I'm scared. And I'm like, Moses, who are you trying to find? Him. Okay, I didn't understand him. Tell me the name. He said, God. God? What you looking for him for, Moses? And he was like, didn't you hear what you read? Did you hear what I read? He says, I need to find him. I need him. And he's crying. And I was like, Moses, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not comfortable right now. And more importantly, I do not know where God is. I just don't know. He left. And I'll never forget him walking out. He was a big, tall man. He pushed that chair back. He slapped his hand on the table and he said, I need to find him. And I was like, please go somewhere else and find him, please. He left. The lady came and she said, in my office right now. I was like, oh boy. I bet I'm going to be the first summer worker to get fired. And she's like, what did you do? And I was like, I didn't do anything. What are you talking about? She said, that man has never shed one tear. And then that's when she told me the story. And I was like, he killed somebody? You guys should have told me that in the first place. Better yet, why am I working with him? I said, I didn't do anything. I read the poem. I read the poem to her. She starts bawling. I mean, like crying. And then I'm just like in a place of, I don't know what to do. So the next day, I made up my mind that I'm going to do the one thing that every strong black woman loves to do, apologize. I am going to apologize to Moses. I practiced. I said it every which way I could think of. And Moses did not come. The next day, he did not come. 3 days, he didn't come. A week, Moses didn't come. I am so scared. I'm thinking, did he do something to himself? I had no idea. Then I started asking around. No one has seen Moses. They said he won't come out of his room. If he comes out for short periods of time. So Moses, after like a week and some change, Moses come back into the activity center. He is not the same guy. He has this glow on his face. I mean, he has this peace, this happiness. I was like, Moses, what happened to you? And he said, I found him. And I was like, who? Who did you find? And he was like, God, I found God. And I was so perplexed. I was like, where was he? And Moses told me this. He said, after you read me that poem, I went to my room. I closed the door. And I started to remember when my grandmother took me to church as a kid. I started to remember the sermons. I started to remember my grandmother's word. My grandmother told me I was going to be a preacher. I was like, your grandmother sure was not hearing from God on that one. Bro. And he's telling me all this. And he says, for 3 days, I told God, I'm not going to eat. I'm not going to sleep. I'm going to stay here until you become real to me. And I was just like scared and mesmerized. I mean, I went to a Pentecostal church. I always thought I was going to die and go to hell, but I thought, oh man, I'm going to get it now. And Moses said, round about the 3rd day, he started to remember the message of the cross. He started to remember that all he needed to do was to ask Jesus to forgive him of his sins and change his life and live for Jesus. Man, he had this joy. He was thriving. I was so perplexed. And I was like, wow, Moses, that's great. And then he begged somebody to get him a Bible. Once they got him a Bible, he said, that's why I didn't come out. I was just reading the Bible. I was reading the Bible as much as I could understand. And then he couldn't understand too much, and he got somebody else to read the Bible for him. So he was going around the hospital asking people to read the Bible to him. I was like, wow. And then Moses asked me this question. Do you want God? No, sir. No, sir. No, sir. No, Moses. No. That's good for you. I am happy for you. I mean, Moses was such a hard individual that word spread around the hospital about Moses had changed. People had started to see that he was just a different person. It was unbelievable. And one day I'm sitting out in the courtyard. It's maybe like 3 or 4 days later. I'm sitting out in the courtyard, and this lady comes, and she's unkempt. And she scared me. She scared me so badly. And she said to me, she said, Are you the one? No, ma'am, I'm not. You are her? Are you her? No, ma'am, I promise you I'm not. Yes, you are. She's all up in my face. And she said, you're the one that wrote Moses that poem. I need one. And then she just started to say like in like language. She was here sometimes and sometimes she wasn't. She was trying to talk about when she went to church. And she was like, I need one. And she said, you write me one, okay? And I lied. I said, I'm not the one, but you know what? I'm going to find that girl, and I'm going to tell her to write you a poem. During my break, I sat down at the typewriter, and I typed, Jesus, help me write a poem for this woman, but don't do anything else. Don't touch me. Don't just leave me like I am. Just help me to write the poem. I wrote this poem. We had set a time for when we were going to meet. She was on time. We met. I sat down. I read her the poem. This woman started crying. And I'm like, I have got to get out of this place. Something's wrong. And then she asked me, she said, how can I get this Jesus? I remember when I was a kid, I went to church and she keeps talking and she's going on and on and on and on and on and on. And I was like, I don't have time for this. And then I looked at her and said, stop. You want to know how to find Jesus? Go to Moses. Moses found him and he can show you exactly how to do it. I was just trying to get rid of the woman. She left and she found Moses. And Moses, I don't know what he told her, but in a week that woman was so different. She had changed. She wasn't babbling on and on and on and on and on anymore. She wasn't doing all those weird things she was doing with her body. And she said she had been carrying all of this guilt and shame. And Moses helped her to understand that Jesus took that away. I was like, Dad, where did Moses get that from? In the Bible, folks, in the Bible. And then another lady came. She had a girlfriend. I wasn't comfortable with that situation at all. I didn't understand it, and I was afraid of her. And she came in, and she had something like a stick, but something in her hand. And she said, this is my girlfriend. First of all, you're going to braid her hair. What? And you better not hurt her. And she got this stick, and she pointed the stick, and then she said, then you're going to write her a poem because she in pain. And she better not be in pain after you finish that poem. Oh, my goodness, I was so scared. And I'm braiding this girl's hair. And if you don't know anything about braiding, it just hurts. She wanted cornrows. And every time she would say, ouch, that girl would look at me with that stick. And I was like, so sorry. Went to the computer. I prayed the same prayer. Prayed the same prayer. Wrote a poem. Can't even remember what was in this stuff. Didn't even care what was in this stuff, to be honest with you. Gave it to the girl. I had to read it to her. She's crying. She's crying. I don't even let her ask. I said, listen, baby, go to Moses. Go to Moses. I wrote 21 poems that summer. And when I wrote the poem, they went to Moses. So I was 16. I didn't want to serve God. I didn't even like God. So I didn't understand what was happening in that moment. But whatever Moses said to those people, they were different. I got a phone call a year later, and half of those people were released from the mental hospital. I was like, what? What? They wanted to release Moses, but Moses said he had walked into his calling. He wasn't going anywhere. I was like, that's not very smart. That's kind of dumb. Again, I grew up in church. My mother was one generation, but I was another one. Moses, his grandmother was one generation. He was another one. See, sometimes if we're not careful, those generations, they won't arise. It took Moses 25 years and the act of God himself. A chance, because we were not supposed to be in that hospital that summer, and we were not supposed to be working with those people. I told them I was going to sue them. They better be glad we didn't have the internet back then. Moses got saved. A year later, half those people that he ministered to, whatever he said to them, were walking out of the hospital free. And Moses is making this commitment to tell everybody about God at the hospital. So the next summer, that was a year later, so we was coming up on that summer, and they said, could you go back to that place? No, ma'am. No, ma'am. I will never go back to that place. I did not go. I did not go. And then a couple of years later, I get this phone call, and this voice says, are you Gloria? Yes. We've been trying to get in contact with you for a long time. Okay. Who are you? So-and-so from the mental hospital. Oh, my God. Are they taking me in? Like, I couldn't fathom why they would be calling me. And she said, we just want to let you know that Moses passed away. And he wrote you a letter. I was like, no, not the letter. Not the letter. And I was just like, okay. And the lady read me the letter. It was the sweetest thing. Because what Moses was most concerned about was my salvation. And Moses said, I'm going to be with the Lord. And I just don't think it's right that you don't join me. And he laid out the whole gospel in that letter. And then at the end of it, he gave a salvation call. I could not believe it. I could not believe it. I said no to the salvation call. I said, thank you, but not right now. But that letter haunted me. It haunted me. It haunted me. And every day I thought about it. And that was one of the many things that God used to bring me to him. And I just remember falling on my knees when I finally did and giving my heart to the Lord. I just was like, man, God, you're so good. Here's my point. They don't arise by themselves. Moses was stuck. He was stuck in whatever situation he was in. He was stuck. He needed a way out. He needed a way out. I was stuck in the situation that I was in. I needed a way out. And when Moses came back and gave me the gospel, it made so much sense. You want to know why? I saw what God did in him. I saw that man walk back through that door. He was changed. I saw those people walk through the center, and they were like, there was something different about them. And then it was like, Jesus, if he hadn't written that letter, would I have stopped? Would I have stopped? No, probably not. We are a generation of people that loves the Lord. But the next generation could easily go astray. Like Eli, going into the innermost holies of holies. And let me read you what the Bible said about his sons. 1 Samuel 2:12. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now, it was the practice of the priest that whenever any one of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled. He would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or the cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up for the priest, he would take that for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fats were burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. So God had a way that he wanted the sacrifice to be done, a way that honored him. But Eli's sons, the one who saw Eli go in and out of the inner room, saw Eli ministering to people, saw Eli doing the work of the Lord, they had another way, and they were so selfish. They wanted everything for themselves, and they just dishonored God. And verse 17 says, this sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. So what I got from this story about Eli was his kids were so close. Church kids, and they missed it. This is why kids' church is so important, because we can't do it by ourselves. You can't do it by yourselves. You know, you come, you do your best to tell these kids, and they're just ratchet. That's my favorite word when I talk about kids, because it's the politest that I can get to describe them. Ratchet. And you do your best. You do your best. But sometimes it takes a village. It takes a tribe. And you need the power of kids ministry. We need the power of kids ministry. Bring them in every Sunday, praying over them, telling them what the Word of God says, trying to pack it down in their hearts, hoping that it's going to stay. Because we don't know if it's going to stay. But when we're faithful, and in the case of Moses, his grandmother took him to church. And in that hour when he was so desperate to get to God, the Holy Spirit brought up those lessons that he learned as a kid. I could not believe that. So we need kids ministry, because this generation may be fine, but we're just one generation away sometimes from just getting further and further away from God. I think about the kids all over in inner cities, all over America, and now apparently in London, these gangs, they take over a whole block. The kids that live in the blocks, you try to reach out to them for Jesus. They want to serve Jesus, but they got to serve that gang. It's an impossible situation. And sometimes there's not anyone to go in and to tell them that there's a different alternative. There's a different way out. There's Jesus. Because the truth is, it costs too much. It could literally cost you your life. In New York City, we had this boy. Man, we tried so hard to keep him on a straight and narrow path, but he wanted to be a gangster. We would bring him to church. We would drag him to church. And he would hear the word. It would take hold of him for a second, and then he'll let it go. And this cycle repeats. And one night, he's out later than he's supposed to be because he's trifling. And his grandma told him to be in, and he decided he's going to stay out. Well, when he finally comes home, there's a car rolls down the street, and they start shooting up the apartment building that he's walking into. Scared him so bad. So bad. I mean, traumatized him. And I'm thinking, okay, he's going to come back to the Lord. And then a couple of weeks after that, there was a drive-by on the next block, and one of his friends, a little kid, got shot and killed. Traumatized this boy. Traumatized him. Guess where he went? He went and joined the gang. And I remember praying to the Lord saying, we've tried everything we could. We've tried everything we could. But we couldn't win him. And I just remember feeling that the Holy Spirit saying, yeah, but those seeds that you planted, that was your job. Plant the seeds. I'll send somebody to water them. I'll send somebody else to nurture them. I'll send somebody else. And it looked very, very scary. I mean, 3-4 years go by, and I didn't see anybody coming by doing anything. I'm like, where are you, God? So when I was leaving Metro after 10 years, I went to say goodbye to all of the kids. And there's this kid coming out. He's all tall now. You can tell that life done beat him up. And he comes, he gives me this big old hug. And he said to me, I know you think I forgot about God, but I didn't. And he said, pray that I come home. And I was like, what? So it's in him? It's really in him? And then I left. And when I went back years later, I asked the grandmother how the kid was doing. By now, he's in his early 20s. And she said, just fine. My boy is serving God. Can you believe it? I can't. But wow. So if we're going to ask the generations to arise, we have to flip the coin. We got to look at it from the opposite side and say, what is it going to cost us if they don't arise? What is it going to cost society if they don't arise? Here's what happened with Eli's kids. God told Eli, straighten them out, get them out, or he said he was going to cut their generation, he was going to cut their lives short. He says he's going to cut their strength, and he's going to cut the strength of the priestly house, and no one will reach an old age. They wouldn't change. And then remember in the story, they went to battle, they were fighting, and the Philistines saw the ark of the Lord coming. They were so scared because they're used to God just giving them a beat down. But then this day, they were like, no, let's get up and fight. And they started beating those Israelites. They took the ark of God, and then they killed Eli's son. They died on the same day, just like God said. And then Eli was so shocked that the ark of God was taken that he fell back and he broke his neck. So what was the cost? The cost was a generation of people that lives will be cut short. You won't live. Your people won't live. Your seed won't live to see an old age. And furthermore, when you get into the priestly role, I'm going to cut that short. All the good that they could have done. These were people who knew the Lord. They had generations on their side of knowing the Lord. And the cost of one generation falling short, one generation doing it their own way, cost a whole line of them to just have a whole different kind of life. Think about the kids that have so much potential. They have so much talent and potential. The things that they could do for the Lord. Man, incredible. The talent that they have. But they're not serving God. So I was watching this Jacksonville, Florida, have these gangs. And it's the saddest story ever. And it's not just happening in Florida, it's happening everywhere. And so what they're doing is they're now getting heavily involved in the rap industry and rap music. So let's say this gang, they're the Bloods, right? So the Bloods will get a beef with this person over here, and what they're going to do is they're going to kill somebody. That is so sad. Just because you belong to this gang. Crazy. So then once they kill this person, then they're going to make a rap song about it, post a rap song. And literally, the gangs are just trading lives. Kids as early as 14, 15, 16, 17, dying senselessly. Why? Because they belong to the Bloods. They belong to the Crips. Imagine if they belong to God. How many lives would be saved? The leaders that's great at recruiting them, if they could recruit them for Jesus, how many lives would be saved? It's so bad now. It's like, if you ever look it up, it'll break your heart. It's a generation that hasn't risen, and they're stuck. So that's Eli's sons. There are no guarantees. We got to work hard at it. We got to give our all at it. We got to be relentless for it. Samuel, the man, the little boy that heard the voice of God, that raised so close to Eli. He wasn't like Eli's sons. He was a man of God. Samuel led the nation. Samuel was also priest. He was also prophet. He ordained the first king. He ordained the second king. He led the whole nation before the Lord. Everybody loved Samuel. Everybody respected Samuel. He was a man of a different generation. But his kids, let me read to you what it says about Samuel's kids. When Samuel, verse 8, 1 Samuel 8, verse 1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Burma, and they said, "You're old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. All right, so Samuel, verse 10, took all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king, and he said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign as commanders in thousands, and some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards, the olive groves, and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and give it to his officials, your male and female servants, the best of your cattle and donkeys. He's going to enslave you." And you know what they said? "No, we want a king over us." They wanted a king over them because the next generation of leadership that they were looking at wasn't worth serving. And they were making this ungodly decision because if this is the best that we have to offer, Samuel, then we'll go through all of this. We'll go through all of this. The cost of that generation was a nation living outside of God's will. God never meant for them to have a king over them. He never did it that way. He gave them judges and he led them. And then for years and years and years, they suffered. One king after the next, after the next, after the next. And when you trace it back, it started with a generation that didn't arise. It costs something when the kids and the youth that we're serving doesn't rise up and serve Jesus. It's not just, okay, that's great, we got a few. So what I'm going to tell you just about one final story about a kid that did arise. And then I want to challenge you to dig a little bit deeper and ask both questions. What happens when they arise, and what happens when they don't arise? Because if you look through the Bible, there were some that did arise, like Joseph. Joseph was a very immature kid who was his father's favorite. He knew he was the favorite, and he acted like any kid that's the favorite. He just flaunted it. And those 10 boys, they just had enough. Yeah, so they were going to kill Joseph. Put him in a well. They sold him. So Joseph leaving home at such a young age. He was a teenager when he was sold into slavery. So Joseph, he gets to Potiphar's house, and he must have been a good-looking teenager. Potiphar's wife is all over him. But Joseph said, no, I will not sin against my God. She ripped his coat off of him. He ran away. He was thrown in prison. He served something like 17 years as a slave, 17 years in prison for standing up to his God. He suffered, but the word was in him. As a kid, the word was in him. We can't decide what these kids would do. We can't decide what they will become, but what we can decide is to reach them and put the word in them. The only way that they're going to arise is that if their God becomes real to them, they're standing on the foundation of his word. And the consequences of Joseph arising is that he was able to save nations. When the famine came, Joseph had an answer. God had given him a strategic answer that not only saved nations, but it saved Joseph's whole tribe. And then when his brothers came, the cost of him arising was healing and forgiveness. Joseph could have extended that feud. He could have killed all of them. He could have had massive bloodshed. He was in his right, but he had arisen. And he saved their lives. He brought them. He took care of them. So we want this generation to arise. We got to do something different. That doesn't mean that you got to go out and do all these crazy things. You got to be so busy. No. But my challenge to you is to take this year, as you pray, write it down. Everything that you've gotten from God, write it down throughout the year and ask God, how can I help them arise? Because unless they're taught, they're not going to understand who God is. So somebody has to teach them. What does that look like for you? What does it look like for you? I'm asking God the same question. Because unfortunately, I was doing fine until I came here. I was like, let him sleep. And then it just started stirring up in me. Like, whoa, man. Oh, man.